Did your thrift savings plan beat the 7% inflation factor in 2021? Hopefully you did, and you also understand how the impact of inflation can outpace your TSP retirement savings. In this episode, we're going to cover historical TSP rates of return compared to inflation and also provide suggestions on how you can diversify your thrift savings plan with the consideration of inflation. Welcome. I'm Ed Smith, President of Valor Wealth Partners, where we're dedicated to educating federal employees on your complex and often underutilized benefits. In this episode, we're really going to be digging down to the TSP and inflation. Now, your TSP is eroded by two factors: inflation and taxes. And today, we're really going to be talking about the loss of purchasing power due to inflation. If you haven't looked at our video before about inflation that we just put out the other week, please take a look at it now because it will really help you set the stage for both what the CPI is, the cost of consumer price index. We'll also look at how inflation affects you as an employee, your paychecks, your pension checks, and also give you some suggestions on how, on a general scheme, you can be able to look at in beating inflation. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the TSP, so please get a baseline from that. We're also going to be going forward with some of the figures that we used in the last video. When we're looking at the TSP and when we're looking at inflation, we want to be looking at the long term. Now, for the sake of this video, we're actually going to shrink that down into a 10-year period of a short-term basis, but long-term for us is generally more than 10 years. The reason why we're only using 10 years is so we can really see the impact on a year-over-year basis on these different types of funds. We're going to be comparing both bond funds and equity funds so you can see them. We'll also give you some suggestions on how you can be able to diversify that portfolio a little bit better and look at that as a bigger picture to beat inflation. The first place we want to look when we're trying to figure out what funds are going to be able to beat inflation is trying to get on a conservative level. So let's take a look at the bond funds, and we'll start with the G fund. In this report or this graph, one of the things that we see is the green bars are inflation, both the CPI-U and CPI-W. You should have gotten a good education from that last video. The blue bars are the bond funds. The light blue is G fund. The dark blue is the F fund. All right, so that gives a little bit. I know this can be a little bit small if you're looking at it on an iPhone or another type of smartphone, but again, it's there and I want to be able to help you out. We are going to have a whole segment that we look at taking a closer look at the numbers. So if you want to see those numbers, it will be a little bit further in the video. We're actually going to dig into these numbers a little bit better. But what we want to look at is the G fund lost money when you look at a 10-year average returns. Okay, so the average return of the G fund was 1.94 compared to the inflation was around 2.14, 2.15. Okay, so it lost money on a 10-year basis. Now the balance may be safe, but it is not keeping up with costs. And this is a very big danger with having the G fund. This is not saying that the G fund is bad. It's just saying compared to inflation, you might want to look at other places than just the G fund alone. Now, when we look at the F fund, which is the darker blue bar, all right, we have almost a 50% increase over the 10-year CPI average, meaning that the CPI averages are around 2.14, 2.15. The F fund was 3.19. So you had a really good increase compared to inflation. But 2 out of the last 10 years of the F fund was negative, which means while you had a better long-term rate of return, again, we're only looking at 10 years here, you still had 2 years that it was negative. So now what we really want to be able to look at, now that we've seen the bond funds and how that relates to the in CPI or inflation, we want to take a look at taking a little bit more risk on your portfolio and looking at the equity funds to see how they fared. We're going to use the same graph. We're just going to add a couple of more bars with a little bit more color in this time just to really see how this really reacts. Okay, so let's look at bringing on the equity funds. With the equity funds, all three of these funds underperformed the CPI-W at least 1 year. And you can see there's some negative years. There's 1 year that they were negative. All three of the equity funds were negative. All right. When we say negative equity funds, we're looking at the C fund in red, the S fund in yellow, which is small to mid caps, and the I fund, which is international, in purple. All right. So when we're looking at these different bars, we really want to be able to see how this performed. Okay. And you can see in different years, specifically like 2018, all three of those equity funds were down. All right. The averages have significantly crushed inflation, though. I mean, these numbers are really good. When you see inflation around 2% and you're seeing average rates of return 9, 15, 17%, that's meaning that is way ahead of inflation, but there's significant risk. All right, so we tend to remember the good times when we're looking at equity funds, but we forget that the bad times. And when we look at the last couple of years, 10 to 15 years, we forget that in 2018, we actually had some negative returns. All right. So we don't want to be able to just be looking at the positive. We want to look at the overall, but on the averages, these are actually doing pretty good. So now you've been a good grasp of bond funds and also equity funds to figure out which fund is best. We really want to take a closer look at the numbers. And as I said, we're going to make this a little bit bigger for you so you can see them versus just being under that bar chart. So hopefully this is able to read on smartphones or whatever device you're looking at it. But here's a lot of numbers and to be able to take a look at this. So let's dig right into these numbers and see what this means on all of these different periods of time over 10 years and the average numbers. Okay, so all of the funds have underperformed inflation at least one time over the last 10 years. So even the equity funds underperformed, but you also have the G and the F. Everybody has underperformed. And as you can see on the yellow boxes, those are the ones that had underperformed inflation. So there's quite a bit of times that they have underperformed in all different categories. There isn't one fund that is best. So there is no magic answer of which fund is good. Now the G fund was lower than the CPIW the most at 5 years, or 50% of the time the G fund underperformed inflation. And that's just the average. That's just 50% of the times, or 5 years out of 10. All right. Now the G fund is also the only fund to underperform the 10-year average of the CPI. So while it is very conservative, it can cost you a lot of money because you're not keeping pace with inflation, or you're just barely keeping up in that range. So to us, diversifying your portfolio is the answer of how to be able to beat inflation with your TSP. When you're trying to build the portfolio of your TSP funds using inflation as the factor, you want to be looking at a couple different factors. One of them is on the long-term basis, the more aggressive portfolios are going to be better for beating inflation because the more aggressive portfolios are going to outpace it on a long term. On a short-term basis, though, you could lose more money on a more aggressive portfolio because of the risk factors. So when you're looking at beating inflation, or as inflation being your only factor, the equity funds, the C, S, and I, will be better funds to beat inflation. But you have to be looking at your risk level. Everybody's risk level is different, so you want to be able to make sure that the risk level of your portfolio is appropriate and not just looking at one factor of inflation. While we're looking at inflation today, don't be over-focused on this one factor. You want to be looking at, is everything going to be good? When do you need the money? How volatile can it be? How much can you handle on the volatility of the portfolios? Now, the life cycle funds are one option that you can choose to try to figure out which portfolio to be able to have. It's a lot easier. You don't have to try to pick the individual funds. For us, we prefer that people actually look at building their portfolio out of the 5 funds because it could be a better mix that is specific to you. We have a whole video on this on asset allocation. If you haven't watched it yet, please take a look at this, and there might be some good insights for you when you're building your own TSP portfolio. If you're still watching, hopefully this information today has been very valuable for you. And please hit that like button so we know to make more videos like this. And please don't keep this a secret. Share it with your friends and the coworkers so they know there's ways to be able to beat inflation with these different areas. In summary, we just want to be looking at a couple different factors. There's no one magic investment to beat inflation. There's short-term and there's long-term factors, so please try to diversify your portfolios for the factors that meet all of your needs, not just the one of inflation. While everybody's talking about it right now, there's a lot more to building your TSP portfolio than just this one factor. As always, we want the best for you and your family, so please get conflict-free, unbiased advice. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to educating you in the next video.